Back in late August of 1989, my friend and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 40-ton yacht named Tamaro from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid handsomely to do so. We had years of sailing experience between us, but the 5,000-mile journey was the furthest either of us had ever been on. We were confident that we could do it, but early on, there was a worrying change in the weather's forecast. Statistically, hurricanes happened really late in the South Pacific and tend to arrive in mid to late October, so by setting sail in late August, we figured that we'd avoid the worst of the bad weather. But as the saying goes, man proposes and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we were faced with a Category 4 hurricane, which whipped up waves as high as 20-story buildings. We'd sailed through gales and storms before, but never a hurricane. We tried to escape it for 3 days, but the boat could only go 15 miles per hour, and so eventually, it caught up with us. It was too late for us to turn around and escape, so we had no choice but to brave it head-on. We put on our raincoats and boarded up the yacht, all while 140 miles per hour winds and 40-foot waves battered against the boat. The wind and rain felt like BB pellets on our skin, and it was like nothing we'd ever felt before. But we were still confident of being able to handle the situation. We just had to wait for the worst to be over. At one point, I remember heading below deck to get something, and then I suddenly heard my fiancé yell out, "Oh my God." We got caught in a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember is my head smashing into something before everything just went fuzzy. I think I must have been out for a minute or two because when I woke up, there was blood all over my face and raincoat, and I was lying on the floor. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I went topside to check on him. The last I'd seen of him, he was strapping himself into the safety harness, but when I went to check on him, the harness was empty, and he was nowhere to be seen. I remember screaming, but I knew I had to pull myself together. There'd be time to grieve later, and if I didn't focus on the task ahead of me, people would end up grieving me too. I knew the yacht had suffered irreparable damage that would make it impossible to sail. The navigation system, engine, and even the sails were all waterlogged or shredded beyond repair. But even worse, the yacht itself was taking on water at crazy speeds. My instincts kicked in, and I started pumping water out of the cabin before using the storm jib and a broken pole to create an improvised sail. The only tools I had at hand were a sextant and a watch, but I had enough sailing experience to use them to navigate to land. After 41 days of drifting in the Pacific, rationing my canned food and water, I finally spotted land. It turned out to be the Hawaiian island of Hilo, and as I slowly drifted towards the harbor, I was spotted by a Japanese ship and rescued. For weeks afterward, I kept one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that got me through. I put all the pain and grief to the back of my mind, and once I was safe, it all came gushing out of me like water through a broken dam. It took me many years to get back to sailing, and these days I'm much more cautious about the jobs I accept. I thought about retiring from it altogether, but after a while, I realized that it's where I belong. If there's one silver lining to the dark cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. On May 19 of 1884, a yacht known as the Mignonette departed the English port of Southampton bound for the coast of eastern Australia. Constructed in 1867, the 52-ton cruiser had been purchased by an Australian lawyer named Jack W., who sought a suitable crew to transport her to Sydney. But it was no small feat. Many experienced sailors noted that the yacht was an inshore boat unsuited to long voyages in open waters. And what's more, even the most experienced sailors were intimidated by the 15,000-mile journey, with many turning the job offer down before a full crew was finally assembled. In the end, a 4-man team was put together, which consisted of Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Almost 2 months into their journey, the crew of the Mignonette found themselves sailing into a gale around 1,600 miles northwest of South Africa's Cape of Good Hope. Despite the fierce winds, their journey was progressing steadily. Then, in order to enjoy a good night's sleep, Captain Dudley gave the order to heave to. In sailing, heaving to is a way of slowing a vessel's forward progress, as well as fixing the helm and sail position so that the vessel does not have to be steered, is commonly used as a way for sailors to take a break or to wait out strong or contrary winds. However, just as the maneuver was completed and young Richard Parker was sent below to prepare tea, a freak wave struck the Mignonette, damaging a bulkhead and causing vast amounts of seawater to flood into her hold. Realizing the yacht was doomed, Captain Dudley ordered his 3 crew members to man their single 13-foot lifeboat. The lifeboat was of flimsy construction, with its boards only a quarter-inch thick, but as the Mignonette began to list and groan, it proved the crew's only source of salvation. Just minutes later, the crew watched as the Mignonette disappeared below the waves, having managed to salvage nothing but a few pieces of navigational equipment and 2 tins of turnips. At first, Captain Dudley managed to stabilize the lifeboat by constructing an improvised sea anchor, a device reminiscent of a kind of waterborne parachute. It dragged behind the lifeboat, slowing its progress slightly and allowing for more effective manual steering. The captain also determined that they must have been around 700 miles from the nearest dry land, meaning that they were unlikely to be rescued anytime soon. During their first night at sea, the crew was forced to fight off a great white shark using nothing but their oars. The next morning, they were able to catch a sea turtle by simply dragging it out of the water. This yielded about 3 pounds of meat each, plus the bones, which, along with the tins of turnips, lasted until July 17th. The sailors planned on drinking the turtle blood to stave off fatal dehydration, but after it became contaminated with seawater, they began imbibing their own urine. By July 20th, the teenage cabin boy Richard Parker had become so sick of drinking his own urine that he began slurping up handfuls of seawater. This only exacerbated his dangerous levels of dehydration, and he fell unconscious shortly afterward. Around the same time that young Parker began to drift into unconsciousness, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks began discussing the prospect of cannibalism. On July 24th, Dudley told the others that it was better for one of them to die so that the others would survive and suggested they should draw lots. Brooks refused, but that night, Dudley once again raised the matter and pointed out that while the childless cabin boy was most probably dying, he and Stevens had wives and families to take care of. The boy would be mourned, but unlike their women and children, his parents would not starve without his wages. This appeared to have been the most effective method of argument, as the next morning, Captain Dudley and Edwin Stevens made the decision to kill Richard Parker, ensuring his blood was fresh enough to drink. Brooks, who had refused to take part in the earlier discussion, claimed he neither agreed nor disagreed with the decision. Captain Dudley then said a prayer, and with Stevens holding the boy still in the event that he woke up, the captain pushed his penknife into Parker's jugular vein and ended his life. Once Parker's heart had ceased to beat, the 3 surviving sailors began butchering his body. Ironically, and despite his early reticence, it was reported that Edmund Brooks was ravenous in his consumption of Parker's flesh, while Edwin Stevens appeared to have a change of heart and ate very little. Speaking of the scene that followed, Captain Dudley later said, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We were like mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." Just a few days later, the survivors were still feasting on Parker's remains when they spotted the sail of a passing ship named the Mignonette and successfully garnered its attention. Finally, on September 6, 1884, the Mignonette sailed into Falmouth Harbor, where the 3 survivors of the Mignonette reported to a customs officer by the name of Mr. Cheeseman. Initially, the men were greeted with great relief, as it was assumed the Mignonette's crew had been lost when it failed to reach its Cape Town checkpoint. Yet, after explaining the grisly methods by which they had survived, the situation took a dramatic turn. Incredibly, the surviving crew members were remarkably candid regarding the retelling of the events and openly admitted to having murdered young Richard Parker before consuming his still warm flesh. Contemporary defense attorneys, who tend to limit their clients' vocabulary to the words "no" and "comment," would consider such a frank admission to be nothing short of madness. But although Captain Dudley and his 2 surviving crew members felt deep shame and guilt, they were comfortable in their confession because, in doing so, they invoked what was known as the custom of the sea. Since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune has humbled even the hardiest of vessels, and those who survived their sinking ships either cast adrift or washed up on some far-flung shore were often faced with what was referred to as the delicate question, to eat or not to eat their dead or dying shipmates. Thankfully, only a very small number of seamen and explorers have been faced with such a grim situation. But with 19th century British culture being so centered around its maritime industries, such incidents became embedded into the public consciousness. For example, in the early 1600s, 7 English sailors were cruising through the Caribbean when they were blown out to sea and cast adrift for 17 days. When they reached the point of starvation, the sailors drew straws to decide who would sacrifice their flesh for the good of the collective. Ironically, the man chosen was the one who suggested the idea in the first place. According to his shipmates, he nobly consented and was swiftly put to death. The sailors survived on the man's flesh until they reached the Isle of St. Martin, and following repatriation to British territory, they were put on trial for murder. However, on the day of their hearing, the colonial judge showed a great deal of sympathy towards them, which, in turn, reflected the views of the wider public. The sailors were pardoned, with the judge stating their actions were of inevitable necessity. More than 200 years later, consuming one's dead shipmates in order to survive periods of deprivation became known as the tradition of the sea. As recently as August of 1874, the crew of the CR Yukon was said to have resorted to cannibalism after their ship went down off the coast of Western Australia. The governor of Singapore had ordered the surviving crew members arrested, and at first, the British government encouraged him to hold a judicial inquiry. However, when it came time to actually prosecuting the men, extended procedural wrangling meant that charges were eventually dropped. This was no accident. During this period, the influence of British Admiralty over their counterparts in government cannot be overstated. Many serving members of Parliament had been officers in Her Majesty's Royal Navy prior to their retirements, so naturally, they had a great deal of sympathy for the survivors of any shipwreck. This didn't mean sailors were free to murder and cannibalize as they pleased, but under the right circumstances, invoking the custom of the sea could prove a powerful defense. The surviving crew members of the Mignonette knew this all too well. Yet, after relaying their story of survival to the Falmouth customs officer, the deliciously named Mr. Cheeseman, the survivors found themselves standing before a police officer named Sergeant Laverty. They were informed that although they were not being placed under arrest, they were not permitted to leave Falmouth until the situation had been resolved. In the hours that followed, an emergency meeting of the harbor's commissioners yielded the following report. The police have apprehended Thomas Dudley, Ed Stevens, and E. Brooks of the yacht Mignonette on a charge of killing at sea on the 20th of July last the boy Richard Parker, after being for 18 days at sea with no food or drink. Summonses were also served on 2 seamen of the German bark Monuma as witnesses in the case, being those who cleared the boat of Parker. When news of the macabre story spread around Falmouth, there seemed to be a surprising amount of sympathy for the Mignonette survivors. When they were officially arrested, a local businessman named John Burton paid a generous amount to bail them out of prison. Even though he had eaten heartily of Parker's butchered flesh, there were deafening cries for clemency when it was heard that Edmund Brooks had refused to take part in the boy's murder. Brooks was acquitted, but despite the controversy, Stevens and Captain Dudley were to be put on trial for murder. Following their transfer to an Exeter courthouse, Stevens and Dudley were found guilty of Richard Parker's murder and condemned to hang. Yet, as one might imagine, the decision was met with outrage from both the Admiralty and the wider British public. Finally, after lengthy and considerable pressure, the death warrants for Stevens and Dudley were torn up and their sentences were reduced to a mere 6 months imprisonment. The case of the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens is one of the few 19th-century criminal procedures still analyzed by law students today. It was also the inspiration for the name of the Bengal tiger in the novel Life of Pi. Some mistakenly believe that the case also inspired Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's easy to understand why. Told from the perspective of the anonymous Gordon Pym, it recounts the tale of a perilous sea voyage in which, following a mutiny and monstrous storm, Pym finds himself in charge of the ship's battered remains and accompanied by just 3 others: Augustus Peters and a young cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Halfway through the novel, having survived for days on nothing but scraps of turtle meat and drops of fresh water, the desperate survivors are forced to invoke the so-called custom of the sea and begin drawing lots to determine the victim. In the end, it comes down to just Gordon Pym and Richard Parker, and it is Parker who is chosen to be eaten. Yet, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was not published in the aftermath of the Mignonette sinking. It was published in 1838, a full 46 years before the Mignonette sank and 29 years before Richard Parker, the ill-fated cabin boy, was even conceived. Some suggested this was evidence of Poe's supposed morbid prescience, a symptom of his ever-lingering genius. But perhaps such a coincidence is suggestive of the repetitive and inevitable nature of the event itself. For, since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune have humbled even the hardiest of vessels. And so perhaps those who survived disasters involving interstellar starships who ended up stranded on some far-flung shore will once again be faced with what was once referred to as the delicate question. When my dad passed away, not only did he pass along his fishing boat, but he also passed along his love of fishing to me. The boat is a which has a decent-sized cabin allowing me to go overnight deep-sea fishing. I usually fish off the coast and would sail for an hour out to sea, then stop and spend the rest of the day fishing. That's exactly what I did one Friday, taking my cousin Tony. We planned to spend the night and fish most of Friday before sailing back. So, after sailing out to sea for about an hour, I picked the spot for us to stop and cast our lines. We brought a radio and tons of beers to make the time more pleasant. The sun started to set, and seeing the sun setting on the horizon with no visual intrusions was a beautiful sight, perhaps the last pleasant thing that would happen that night. By the time the sky was completely dark, we had already packed our stuff for the night and were inside the cabin playing cards and eating burgers. Mid-conversation, Tony stopped me and told me to listen. There was the sound of a boat motor in the distance. We left the cabin to look into the horizon, but with no moon, it was just too dark to see more than maybe 50 feet in front of us. But over the calm waves, we did hear a boat motor. Whoever was out there didn't have their lights on. The lights in my cabin were on, which was definitely enough for anyone to see us and avoid hitting us. We were expecting the sound of the other boat to sail away into the night. However, it seemed to circle us for a bit, then abruptly stopped. The motor just cut. There was nothing but the sound of the calm water splashing against the boat. Tony started acting a little paranoid. He thought we were being stalked. He wanted me to use the spotlight to look for where this boat could be. I didn't want to do that because that would be a bit obnoxious and obvious. To make him happy, though, I started to drive the boat for a few minutes away from the last direction we heard that engine stop. Maybe I did it because I was a little suspicious about it as well. After a solid 5 minutes of driving the boat in the opposite direction, I killed the motor and we went back inside the cabin to resume playing cards. It felt like only seconds after we sat down, we heard it again. This time I heard it first, and it sounded like the motor was being given much less gas. We went outside again, and at that instant, the sound stopped. This time, I agreed with Tony, turning on the spotlight was a necessity. The spotlight only rotated 180 degrees, so I turned the boat a little to the right so that I could point the light out in the direction we heard the boat. The beam of light shot far into the horizon. I felt my heart racing as I slowly turned the light to point more to the right, and finally, I stopped when the light started to land on a boat floating not too far away from us. I turned the light off at once. I told Tony to turn the cabin lights off as well. I put the boat in full throttle and steered away from the area. I steered the boat for about 5 to 10 minutes before thinking it was enough. We hung out outside for a while to ensure we weren't followed again. When it seemed safe to do so, we went to sleep. However, I woke to a thumping coming from above my head, above the cabin. I looked over at Tony sleeping on the couch. I whispered his name a few times to wake him up, and I pointed up at the ceiling. He looked up, then back at me with a look on his face telling me he heard the thumps. I opened the door to the deck and ran outside and saw 2 men, one on the bow of my boat, the other on a boat floating directly next to mine. Tony came running out behind me. Both of the men slowly put their hands up in front of their faces and claimed they meant no harm. The one on my boat said they were simply almost out of gas and needed help. He said he was going to knock on my cabin door to ask for assistance, but in my head, I was thinking, why was he on the bow of my boat? Done very low-key, I flicked Tony's thigh to indicate to him that I was getting ready to do something rash. The guy stepped down from the front of the boat to the lower deck, right in front of Tony and me. He was significantly taller and bigger than us. He looked at me for a few moments and reached out his hand, expecting a handshake. Without saying anything, I knew something was about to go down with these guys, and for all I knew, that could start with my shaking his hand. Instead of shaking his hand, I pushed the guy overboard into the water with all my strength and ran up the stairs to turn the boat on while I yelled at Tony to make sure they didn't get back on the boat. We were able to lose them in the night for good this time. I didn't stop, though I kept going the full 2 hours straight back to the shore. We made it back to my dock and slept on my boat that night. The next morning, we packed up and drove home. Strange things can happen at sea in the dark, but I never anticipated anything like that. I don't know what those guys were planning on doing to us on my boat, but considering they had been making a point of stalking us, I know it was nothing good. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.